What if the most familiar words in the Bible are not actually understood by most people, but quietly misunderstood in a way that changes everything about how they live, suffer, and even survive their darkest moments? Because Psalm 23 is often spoken like comfort, almost like a soft background prayer for difficult days, but what if it was never meant to comfort you in the way you think? What if it was meant to completely dismantle the way you believe control works in your life? And if that sounds like an exaggeration, stay with this for a moment, because the deeper we go into these words, the more something unsettling begins to emerge beneath the surface. Something that doesn't just soothe the mind, but confronts it. Because in the silence just before everything begins to make sense, there is a hidden tension most people never notice. A tension between who we think we are and what it means to be led. Before anything is explained, before any meaning is extracted, there is a moment the psalm pulls you into almost without permission. A place where noise fades, not because life becomes easier, but because something inside you finally stops resisting. And in that stillness, the first line appears, simple on the surface, but carrying a weight that quietly challenges the entire structure of modern thinking. The Lord is my shepherd. But here is where the shift begins. Because most people read this as poetry, as metaphor, as spiritual language meant to calm fear. Yet beneath it lies a question that quietly destabilizes everything. What does it actually mean to be a sheep in a world that worships control, independence, and self-management? And more importantly, what happens when you realize you might already be living as one without admitting it? Because modern life doesn't announce its burden directly. It disguises it as ambition. It hides it inside productivity. It feels like progress, but underneath, something else is happening. A constant pressure to hold everything together, to anticipate outcomes, to manage uncertainty, to predict pain before it arrives. And so life becomes less about living and more about controlling what might go wrong next. But the psalm doesn't enter that system. It interrupts it. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And suddenly, the language shifts from control to dependence. But not the kind of dependence that feels weak in the way we define weakness. Something far more confronting, because this isn't asking you to rely on advice or inspiration or even guidance at a distance. It is introducing a relationship where direction is no longer something you design, but something you receive. And that is where resistance begins. Because if a shepherd leads, then the one being led is not the one in control of the path. And that creates a silent conflict in the human heart, because control has become the most protected illusion of modern life. Even when life feels chaotic, we still try to hold on to the idea that we're the ones steering it. But this single line begins to loosen that illusion, not by force, but by invitation. And yet it doesn't stop there. I shall not want. At first, it sounds like absence of desire. But the deeper meaning is far more unsettling, because it suggests that something within desire itself begins to change. Not that life stops containing lack, but that the inner experience of lack no longer defines the soul in the same way. And that creates a shift most people don't notice until they are already inside it. Because what if the deepest exhaustion in modern life is not physical at all, but spiritual? What if it is not caused by doing too much, but by believing you are responsible for holding everything together? And what if that belief is quietly breaking something inside you that no achievement can repair? This is where the psalm begins to expose something uncomfortable, not about God, but about the human condition. Because it suggests that anxiety is not only a reaction to circumstances, but a reflection of misplaced trust. A heart that believes it must secure its own future never truly rests in the present. It only pauses briefly before resuming the same silent struggle again. And so the psalm introduces something radically different. A shepherd, not a consultant, not a distant observer, not a symbolic presence you invoke in emergencies, but a shepherd. Someone who leads, directs, and carries responsibility for the path itself. And that changes everything about what surrender actually means. Because surrender is not collapse, it is relocation of trust. But here is where the tension deepens. Because the human mind does not surrender easily. It resists the idea that vulnerability could be wisdom. It confuses dependence with loss of dignity. And so even while reading these words, something inside pushes back quietly, asking whether this level of trust is even possible in a world like this. And that resistance becomes the very doorway the psalm begins to work through. Because the next movement does not explain life, it interrupts it. He makes me lie down in green pastures. And this is where everything begins to feel more intentional than expected. Because the language shifts from comfort to action, not suggestion, but movement imposed from outside the self. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What does it mean to be made to rest? Because the human mind does not naturally stop. Even in silence, it continues, planning, remembering, anticipating, analyzing. Rest is not its default state. Motion is. Control is. And so the idea of being led into rest suggests something deeper than relaxation. It suggests intervention. And intervention is never gentle in the way we expect it to be. Because sometimes what forces rest is not peace, but disruption. Plans collapse. Structures fail. Stability shakes. And what felt secure suddenly becomes uncertain. And in those moments, something begins to happen that is not immediately understood. The soul is being taken out of its patterns, not to punish it, but to break its dependence on those patterns. And this is where the psalm becomes difficult to misunderstand as comfort alone. Because green pastures are not just peaceful environments. They are places where striving stops working, where effort becomes unnecessary, where survival is no longer dependent on constant mental labor. And that shift is not always welcomed because it removes the illusion that control was ever fully reliable in the first place. And just when the mind begins to adjust to this idea of rest, the psalm moves again. He leads me beside still waters. And now the imagery becomes even more precise. Because still waters are not chaotic. They are not turbulent. They are not demanding attention. They reflect instead of overwhelm. And in that reflection, something uncomfortable can emerge, clarity. Because stillness does not hide reality. It reveals it. And this is where many people hesitate without realizing why. Because in stillness, the noise that normally covers internal truth begins to fade, and what remains is not always comfortable. Regret, fatigue, unprocessed emotion, longing, questions that were previously drowned out by activity. But the psalm does not avoid this moment. It leads into it. Because what is being restored is not behavior, but something deeper. He restores my soul. And suddenly the language shifts again. Because restoration implies damage or wear or depletion over time. It implies something has been carried that was never meant to be permanent. And that realization introduces a quiet question. What has life been doing to the soul that it now requires restoration? Not repair in a mechanical sense, but reordering. Because restoration here is not about returning to an old version of yourself. It is about becoming something recentered, something realigned, something no longer fragmented by constant internal pressure. But even this restoration does not happen in isolation. It happens while walking through something far less comfortable, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And here, the tone changes, because this is no longer peaceful imagery. This is confrontation with uncertainty itself, not theoretical fear, but lived instability. The valley is not optional. It is part of the path. And that alone challenges the idea that spiritual life is meant to remove difficulty. But what makes this line even more powerful is what it does not say. It does not say absence of death. It says shadow. And a shadow only exists when something greater is present nearby, which means even in darkness, something real is still standing close enough to cast it. And that shifts the meaning of fear entirely, because the psalm does not promise escape from the valley. It promises presence inside it. But that realization does not fully settle yet, because the next words begin to transform fear itself. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And here, something subtle happens. The focus is no longer on what is happening externally, but on what is present internally. Because fear does not disappear by explanation. It dissolves when isolation is broken. And that is where everything begins to change direction again. Because now the psalm is no longer only describing guidance. It is introducing presence so close that fear loses its authority. And yet, even this is not the end of what is unfolding. Because what comes next suggests that comfort is not always soft, and correction is not always rejection. And what appears to be protection might also be preparation for something the soul is not yet ready to understand. But to see that, we have to go deeper into what it means when even correction becomes comfort. And that is where everything begins to shift again. And that is where the psalm takes a turn that most people feel but rarely pause long enough to understand, because it introduces something that feels almost contradictory at first glance. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And immediately, something inside the human mind resists that sentence, because rod and comfort do not naturally belong in the same category. One suggests correction, the other suggests relief. One implies discipline, the other implies safety. And yet here they are, placed together without apology, as if the contradiction itself is the point. Because what if comfort is not always softness, but structure? What if the very thing that feels like resistance is actually what prevents collapse later on? And more importantly, what if the soul is not only comforted by what soothes it, but also by what corrects it before destruction becomes inevitable? But this is where the psalm becomes even more unsettling in its honesty, because it refuses to let comfort remain emotionally predictable. It suggests that divine care is not passive approval of every direction the soul takes, but active involvement in shaping where it is going. And that immediately challenges something deeply human, the desire to be left entirely unchallenged, because challenge feels like interruption. But interruption, in this context, may actually be protection disguised as pressure. And so the question quietly shifts beneath the surface. What if the most painful moments of correction were not rejection at all, but guidance that refuses to let you continue towards something that would eventually break you? But the psalm does not pause there long enough for certainty to settle. It moves again deeper into imagery that becomes even harder to interpret through surface logic. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. And suddenly the scene changes completely. We are no longer in valleys or still waters. Now we are at a table. But it is not a private table. It is not set in isolation. It is set in the presence of opposition, and that detail changes everything. Because most human instincts assume peace requires removal of threat, safety requires distance from danger, stability requires silence from conflict. But here, none of that is happening. The enemies are still present. The tension is still visible. The environment has not been sanitized, corrected, or cleared. And yet, a table is prepared anyway, which forces a difficult realization. Provision is not waiting for perfect conditions. And that thought alone begins to destabilize how most people understand security. Because if nourishment can exist in the presence of opposition, then opposition was never fully in control of the outcome in the first place. But there is something even more subtle happening here that is easy to miss. Because a table is not just about survival. It is about sitting. It is about presence. It is about receiving what is given without panic, even when circumstances suggest panic would be more natural. And so the image becomes almost uncomfortably powerful, because it suggests a kind of stability that does not depend on external approval, external silence, or external safety. It depends on something else entirely, the presence of the one who prepares the table, and that is where attention begins to shift away from surroundings and toward relationship. Because suddenly, the most important detail is not the enemies, it is not the tension, it is not even the danger, it is the fact that something higher is still able to sustain life inside it. And that redefines everything, because now the question is no longer, how do I escape what surrounds me? But instead, what is sustaining me inside what surrounds me? And that question does not leave quickly. It stays. It grows. and it begins to reshape perception itself. But even that is not the end of the transformation, because the psalm continues, and now it moves into language that feels even more intimate, almost personal, in a way that goes beyond guidance or provision. You anoint my head with oil, and here something shifts again, because this is no longer about direction or survival. This is about identity being marked, confirmed, and set apart. In ancient understanding, anointing was never casual. It was deliberate. It was intentional. It was reserved for recognition, healing, and assignment. It was not something you achieved through effort. It was something that was placed upon you. And that alone begins to challenge modern identity deeply, because so much of modern life is built on construction of self, building identity, proving identity, maintaining identity, competing for identity. But here, identity is not built through struggle. It is received through being known. And that creates an internal tension, because if identity is received rather than earned, then the constant pressure to prove it begins to lose its foundation. And that realization is not immediately comfortable, because a life built on proving itself does not easily release that burden. But the psalm does not wait for permission to continue reshaping perception. It moves again. My cup overflows. And now the imagery expands beyond sufficiency into something that cannot be contained in simple survival logic, because overflow is not about enough. It is about more than enough. It is about excess that cannot be controlled or tightly measured. But even here, the psalm is not simply speaking about external abundance. It is pointing towards something internal that is expanding beyond its previous limits, as if the capacity of the soul itself is being stretched to hold more than it used to be able to carry. And that introduces a strange reversal, because what once would have overwhelmed the soul is now being contained without collapse. Not because life has become easier, but because the soul itself is being reshaped. And then, almost quietly, the psalm adds something that changes the emotional weight of everything that came before it. In the presence of my enemies. Again, not after enemies are gone, not once conflict disappears, but within it, which means the psalm is repeating something intentionally now, as if to make sure it cannot be misunderstood. Peace is not conditional on external absence of tension. Stability is not dependent on surroundings becoming perfect. Instead, something deeper is happening within contradiction itself. And that contradiction begins to feel like a pattern, because first there is guidance in uncertainty, then rest in exhaustion, then restoration in brokenness, then presence in fear, then provision in opposition, then identity in limitation, and now overflow in contradiction. And slowly a realization begins to form that the psalm is not describing separate spiritual moments. It is describing a continuous transformation of perception itself. And that transformation leads into the next movement, where time itself begins to be reinterpreted. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And here, something changes in the language that is easy to overlook at first, because it does not say goodness and mercy visit occasionally. It does not say they appear only in certain seasons. It does not even say they accompany from a distance. It says they follow, but the original force of that idea is stronger than passive following. It carries the sense of pursuit, active movement, consistent direction, as if grace itself is not waiting to be discovered, but is moving toward the person continuously. And that creates a reversal most people do not expect, because we usually think of ourselves as the ones searching for meaning, searching for clarity, searching for connection, searching for God. But here, the direction is inverted. Something is also searching for us. And not occasionally, continuously. All the days of my life removes every exception. It does not divide life into sacred and ordinary. It does not separate moments of awareness from moments of distraction. It includes everything. And that is where the tension becomes undeniable. Because if goodness and mercy are truly pursuing every moment, then even the moments that feel distant are not disconnected in the way they seem. Even confusion is included. Even weakness is included. Even silence is included. Nothing is outside of it. And that realization begins to reshape time itself, because the future is no longer empty space waiting to be filled. It becomes something already moving toward the soul. But the psalm is still not finished, because it ends with a statement that is not simply poetic closure, but destination. And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And at first, it sounds like an ending. But the deeper it is examined, the more it feels like something far more permanent than a conclusion. Because dwelling is not visiting. It is not temporary experience. It is not occasional connection. Dwelling is remaining. And that changes everything about how the entire psalm is understood. Because everything before it, the leading, the restoring, the guiding, the preparing, the anointing, the overflowing, the pursuing, all of it was moving toward this one reality. Not moments of connection, but continuous belonging. And yet, even this idea is not only about what comes after life, because the psalm quietly suggests something that is easy to miss unless you slow down long enough to notice it. That dwelling begins now, not later. Because every moment of trust, every moment of surrender, every moment of letting go of control is already a participation in that reality. Which means eternity is not only something waiting at the end of life, it is something that begins reshaping how life is experienced right now. And that brings everything back to the beginning in a way that feels almost unavoidable. Because the psalm started with a simple statement of belonging. The Lord is my shepherd. But it ends with permanent dwelling. And in between those 2 points, the entire structure of human perception is slowly rewritten. Fear is reinterpreted. Control is dismantled. Desire is reshaped. Identity is redefined. Time is reframed. And presence becomes the final reality that holds everything together. But even after seeing all of this, one question still quietly remains underneath it all. Not whether the shepherd leads, but whether the soul is finally ready to stop resisting being led. Because everything in this psalm is moving toward one silent conclusion that cannot be ignored anymore. Peace was never meant to be achieved through control. It was meant to be discovered through surrender. And surrender is not the end of something being lost. It is the beginning of something being found. And that realization, that surrender is not loss, but return, is where Psalm 23 begins to feel less like something you read and more like something you are being slowly drawn into, almost against the resistance of your own inner instincts. Because even after everything revealed so far, there is still a deeper layer most people never fully cross into. A place where the psalm stops being understood as comfort and starts becoming confrontation with the deepest assumptions about how life actually works. Because if surrender is truly the beginning of being found, then the question is no longer about whether the shepherd exists in the text. The question becomes whether the shepherd has been present in the patterns of your life all along, even in the moments you interpreted as chaos, delay, or loss. And that is where the psalm quietly shifts again, not by changing its words, but by changing how those words begin to feel when you sit with them long enough. Because what once sounded poetic begins to feel structural, like it is describing not just belief, but reality operating underneath experience. The Lord is my shepherd. It still appears simple, but now it carries a weight that cannot be reduced to metaphor anymore, because everything that follows in the psalm depends on this single relationship being real, not symbolic. If there is no shepherd, then everything else collapses into poetry. But if there is, then everything that feels random may not be random at all. And that creates an internal tension that most people avoid without realizing it. Because it means life is not just happening to you, it is being guided through you. And guidance, by definition, removes the illusion that everything is directionless. But the psalm does not argue. It reveals through progression, because after leading through still waters, restoring the soul, walking through valleys, preparing tables, anointing identity, and overflowing the cup, something becomes clear. This is not a collection of emotional states. It is a continuous process of transformation where the soul is being reshaped in stages it does not fully understand while it is happening. And that brings us back to something deeply uncomfortable, because the valley of the shadow of death was never presented as an exception. It was presented as part of the path, And that alone disrupts a belief many people carry quietly inside, that difficulty means something is wrong with the journey. But here, difficulty is not removed from the journey. It is included within it, and somehow still does not cancel presence. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And now something even more subtle becomes visible. The psalm does not say evil disappears. It does not say danger dissolves. It does not say uncertainty is eliminated. Instead, it changes the location of focus entirely. Not what is around me, but who is with me. And that shift is everything. Because fear does not primarily come from circumstances, it comes from isolation, from the feeling that you are alone inside those circumstances. And so the psalm does something radical without changing the external world at all. It changes the interpretation of presence within it. And that means fear is not solved by control, but by relationship. But even that idea is not fully absorbed yet, because the human mind naturally returns to control as a default response. It wants certainty that it can manage. It wants outcomes it can secure. It wants systems that do not require trust in the unseen. And the psalm quietly keeps challenging that instinct, because next it says something that feels almost illogical at first glance. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. And again, the contradiction returns. Presence of enemies and preparation of peace. Same space, opposite realities. But instead of removing tension, the psalm places stability inside it, which suggests something most people are not prepared to accept immediately, that peace does not always require removal of conflict. Sometimes it requires a deeper kind of grounding that conflict cannot interrupt. And that changes how suffering itself is interpreted. Because suffering is no longer proof of absence. It becomes a location where presence may still be active in ways not immediately visible. But even here, the psalm is not asking for intellectual agreement. It is describing a lived experience that only becomes understandable when it is entered, not analyzed from a distance. And then it adds something even more intimate. You anoint my head with oil. And this is where identity becomes the center of transformation again. Because the psalm is no longer only describing external circumstances, it is now describing how the self is being redefined within them. Anointing is not self-made identity. It is received identity. And that directly challenges the modern assumption that identity must always be built through achievement, comparison, or validation. Because here, identity is not constructed upward. It is received downward. Not earned through performance, but given through recognition. And that creates a silent internal shift. Because if who you are is not something you constantly have to prove, then the pressure of proving begins to lose its authority. And when that pressure loosens, something unexpected happens. The soul begins to breathe differently. Not because life becomes easier externally, but because it is no longer carrying the same invisible burden internally. My cup overflows. And now the language becomes even harder to contain in ordinary categories. Because overflow is not survival. It is not maintenance. It is not just enough. It is more than capacity can hold in its previous state. But the key detail is not just abundance. It is expansion. Because overflow implies the vessel itself is changing. Not just what is placed inside it, but what it is capable of receiving without breaking. And that introduces a quiet but powerful idea. Transformation is not only about changing circumstances, it is about increasing internal capacity to hold what life brings. Which means the psalm is not just describing a better life, it is describing a changed soul. And then, once again, it repeats something that anchors the entire message into reality instead of idealism. In the presence of my enemies, because the psalm refuses to remove contradiction from the equation. It insists that abundance can exist inside tension, that peace can exist inside pressure, that stability can exist without external agreement. And that repetition is not accidental, it is reinforcement. Because the human mind resists this idea repeatedly. It wants peace to be clean, predictable, isolated from conflict. But the psalm keeps refusing that version of peace. Because real transformation is not escape from life. It is a different way of existing within it. And then comes a line that quietly redefines the entire direction of human experience. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. But now, after everything that has come before, this no longer sounds like a passive statement. It sounds like movement, continuous movement, persistent movement, something not reacting to your awareness but operating beyond it. And that changes everything again. Because if goodness and mercy are following, then life is not moving into uncertainty alone. It is moving through something already accompanied by intention. But the most unsettling part is not that they follow. It is that they do not stop. All the days of my life removes every exception, every gap, every unnoticed moment, every ordinary day that feels spiritually empty. Nothing is excluded, which means even when you are not aware of it, the movement is still happening. Even when you feel distant, the pattern has not changed. Even when life feels static, something is still progressing toward you. And that introduces a question that lingers longer than expected. What if the direction of your life has never been as disconnected as it sometimes feels? What if what looks like randomness is actually part of a larger continuity you are only seeing in fragments? And the psalm does not answer that directly. It simply continues, "And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." And now the final shift happens, because dwelling is no longer just an ending. It becomes the ultimate state of being the entire psalm has been moving toward. Not temporary comfort, not occasional clarity, not moments of connection, but permanent belonging. And what is most striking is that this belonging is not described as something achieved at the end of struggle, but something that begins to form through every act of trust along the way, which means the destination is not separate from the journey. It is formed within it. And that brings everything into a final confrontation with a single idea that quietly underlies the entire psalm, that the real transformation was never about changing the outside world first. It was about changing the way the soul understands what has been happening all along. Because once perception changes, the same life begins to mean something entirely different. And that leaves only one remaining tension beneath everything that has been revealed so far. Not whether the shepherd leads, but whether the soul is finally willing to stop interpreting life as something it must control and start recognizing it as something it is already being carried through,